How's it going? Welcome back to Dylan Pickups blog. So today we're going to talk about old pickups versus new pickups, winding versus, rewinding versus replacing. We get that question all the time. I'll have somebody, with a fairly modern pickup, call me, be like, hey man, this thing's like 10, 15 years old and it's not doing what it was supposed to. Can you rewind it for me? Is that cost effective? What's the difference? That sort of thing. The real answer to that is it depends on what you're looking to achieve by rewinding a pickup. If you're trying to save money, then it's not the cool thing to do, because buying a pickup hand wound is, or replacing it with something off the shelf is oftentimes the same or less money actually than rewinding. The only time it's possible that you really want to rewind a pickup is obviously if you can't find the pickup anymore. Let's say you have some old de-armand gold foil mustache that is, you only have one and it doesn't work. And those are ridiculously hard to find and they're expensive. I think I'm going to be working on a Hofner base that the pickups are really, really hard to find and they're notorious for going bad because of how they were made. That sort of thing makes sense because now you have all this period correct stuff in there with new winding wire, obviously. But then it does make sense. If you just have, a 1989 Strat that the pickup goes bad in it because it rusted or because it got damaged or something, then it's not really worth it. The other thing that might make it worth it is there is a difference between, let's talk about how a pickup degrades over time, okay, and what can happen. So everything obviously decomposes over time. The wire in the windings, it doesn't really degrade, I guess, unless it gets tarnished, but then usually you have like shorting problems or other things like that. The other thing about the winding wire though is the insulation on the wire itself. Now obviously there are many different qualities and kinds of insulation. Plain enamel is that purple stuff that you see on older pickups. There's poly, which is basically like a polyurethane, heavy formvar. There's all kinds of different ones. There's about somewhere right around 20 different kinds of insulations. There's probably 3 or 4 mainly that are used on pickups. Plain enamel is the old purple stuff that you see on vintage pickups from the late 40s, early 50s on through the 60s. Fender switched over to a heavy formvar. That literally is just an enamel coating that's brushed on the wire as it's made, more or less. It's not brushed on there, but that's pretty much how it works. That stuff can break down over time. You got to watch it when you buy. Don't save money on coil wire if you're trying to make your own pickups. Some people will take plain enamel. They'll take a regular poly-coated wire and they'll dye that polyurethane the dark color to make it look like it's plain enamel, and it's not. And the thickness of it makes a difference in how the thing sounds. So, you gotta be careful of that. So as the pickup gets older, that insulation can break down. You gotta remember that when the coil is assembled, okay, so we have the top and the bottom bobbins and that coil is in there, that really is just a bunch of wires laying on top of each other. And remember that since our guitar works by vibration, and you got to chase rattles in your guitar. Sometimes a pickup ring comes loose. I mean, it's just like a motorcycle or anything else. You got to stay on it to make sure that stuff doesn't rattle. Remember that those windings are beating against each other the entire time. Now, old pickups, a lot of times were not potted. So that means that vibration is happening between those wires constantly. When we wax pot a pickup, we minimize that quite a bit. People think that it's just for, getting rid of feedback. But actually, it stabilizes the pickup to the point that it doesn't wear, actually, because those wires are not like smacking against each other all the time. how the pickup is wound, if it's loose, if it's tight, you know, that sort of stuff. Stuff can break down over time, causing your pickup not to work. The other thing that can happen is your pull pieces, whatever, there's only 5 there, so we'll call it a base, but your pull pieces, if they are Alnico rod magnets, Alnico will degrade over time. And it can actually, I mean, by the time any period of time goes by, reasonable few years period of time goes by, it could degrade up to like 30%. Now, the thing is that's where some of that sweet tone happens, is because of how those pickups degrade. So this might be a situation where you do want to have a pickup rewound. Let's say you have a 1972 Strat that has obviously Alnico rod magnets in it, and you're like, the pickups don't work anymore. Oh, should I do it because it'll screw with the value of the guitar? A broken guitar is hardly ever as worth as much of one that works. So yeah, maybe rewind it, and it will cost you more money. So I mean, our Strat pickups are only 69 bucks a piece. It's going to cost you probably more money than that to rewind that vintage pickup, because it takes a long time it takes a lot of work to figure out what we're doing to make sure that it's the same as it was when we started. Unwinding and looking at everything, and I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into it, more than just making a pickup. So you're going to spend some dough to do that, but in that situation it might be worth it, because you're retaining that period of time of decay of those magnets. Now obviously I can simulate that by gouging a magnet and then degaussing it off until it's similar to the other one, but I wouldn't. I would use the original magnets in the pickup. Ceramic magnets, none of that stuff applies. Just get a new pickup. Old bar magnets from, old rough cut bar magnets from old Gibson pickups and stuff, if it's really, really worth it to you, then yeah, then maybe rewind them. But don't expect to save money, because the time that goes into it is time, and time is money. So just remember that you're not saving money, but you're trying to, if you really want to keep the thing as original as possible. So let's talk about that. If you'll notice on DylanPickups.com, the word vintage doesn't appear anywhere. I don't say the word vintage on my website because we don't make vintage stuff. And in the truest sense of the word, there are very few people, if any, that actually do. There is period correct and there is vintage. I use period correct stuff. If you want something that looks like and sounds like a 52 Tele pickup, I will use the same stuff they used back then. It will not be from back then. There is some new old stock material out there, but very few pickup winders have access to it, and very few people are willing to pay the amount of money that it takes to secure the vintage stuff, new old stock stuff. Now the bottom line is, I don't want to use it anyway because it's probably going to break down on you. I mean, that's just a kind of a blanket statement in a little bit of my opinion. I'll be honest with you though about that. That is my opinion. But if I'm going to build a pickup, we're going to use stuff that, first of all, the difference is this. Let's say you make a wire back in 1958. The way that wire is made is pretty much the same way it's made now. Now the materials in the wire, basically all they do is they take a rod. It could be like as big around as this marker, okay? And they just roll it and roll it and roll it and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner until it gets thin enough to be used on a pickup. And then they put an insulation on it, okay? Now the way they do that now is, believe it or not, there's like a laser that goes over it and under it, and they can monitor the tolerances of how thick and how thin that wire is. Now that old wire, it still has tolerances and it wobbles, but that old wire, they didn't have all that stuff. They just made it, okay? So there is a difference in the old wire versus the new wire, but the bottom line is it reasonable to even do, okay? And second of all, is the person going to be willing to pay it? Sometimes they are, but that's not what we do here. We just make pickups, and we make pickups that sound the way you want them to sound. But that's why we don't say vintage, because we aren't trying to push a vintage product, because unless it's old, it's not vintage. And what I bought last week is not old. and what we used yesterday, that pickup is not old. Now, do we use gray bottom strap bobbins on every one? Absolutely. I like them because they're stronger. They don't bend, you know, the little ears don't bend up. There's reasons why you do various things, but remember that when you're having a pickup made and you just call up and say, I want it vintage spec so-and-so and so, and they say, okay, and they send you something, that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting what you want. You got to remember that when we are talking about your pickups, every variable is a variable. I mean, everything you can choose. So if you call me up and say, I want a vintage tele pickup, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? Well, I just want it to sound like a 52 tele. Well, I can do that, and I can do that with modern stuff that is not going to break down, that is going to be wax potted, that is not going to have, you know, feedback and all this kind of stuff, and it's not going to be noisy, unless you want that. If you want noisy and ice picky and, you know, then yeah, we can do that. But the idea is that either you're going to reproduce an old sound with new parts, or you're going to use your old parts and update them with new parts to try to keep it as close to the old sound as possible. That sounds really confusing when I say it like that, because basically it is. The bottom line is you don't want to just buy off of a label. And this doesn't matter whether you buy from me or somebody else. You know, obviously in these videos, you know that I try to keep this stuff as marketing free as possible. I'm just trying to give you some ideas of what we do around here. So when the next time you go and buy a set of pickups and you say, I want vintage whatever, think about what that means to you. Think about whether those questions are being answered by the person on the other side of the phone, if they answer the phone, or through an email or on their website or whatever, how accessible they are to this information. Because that means a little bit different to somebody. And what's important to you about the tone? Is it important to you that when you open up the guitar, it looks like a 1959 Les Paul, even though it's a 2004 Epiphone Les Paul? Does that matter? Do you want it to be all ice picky and super tons of treble like a 59 PAF? Because they are, if you've never actually heard one. All those things are questions that you should ask. So the vintage versus modern thing is really kind of irrelevant. And that's why we don't say it. If you want to restore an old guitar to be perfect, like an old guitar, then that is a possibility. But if you want to make a pickup and you want it to sound like you want it to sound, then just throw those labels out the window and figure out what you actually want and what's important to you. And that can be duplicated by myself or many other pickup builders. That can be done. But don't paint yourself into a corner and don't end up with something you don't want just by saying, I want a vintage spec so-and-so pickup. Don't do that. I wouldn't recommend it anyway. Because, like I said, you might not end up with what you actually want, because that idea of vintage or old or whatever you want to call it, I call it old, is different to everybody, and their reasons for choosing it is different for everybody. So just ask questions. That's probably the bottom line. Ask a lot of questions and don't assume anything, because remember, everything is a variable. And most of these variables, the only variable that's probably really hard to control is the source of new old stock vintage parts. That's a tough one. That's probably the hardest thing. Everything else, wind count, wind style, bobbin material, magnet age, magnet gauze, anything you want about a pickup is pretty much infinitely variable. So that's where it really comes down to calling up a guy and saying, hey man, I want this sound. I don't like this about my pickup. And ask the real questions. Figure out what's in your rig, all those various tones. And then you can make a choice and say, do I want to rewind the pickup that's in my guitar? Is it worth that money? Do I want to put a new one in it off the shelf from a larger company? Or do I want to have something custom wound? And then of course price obviously goes into there, but I would say price is the last thing. It's your instrument, so you want what you want. Don't cut corners on your tone. don't cut corners on your tone. I'm just gonna say it like that. If you gotta wait an extra few months, it's worth it, man. Don't cut corners on your tone. So hopefully that was helpful. Understand what's what, how things age, and just honestly, like I said, I keep myself out of this as much as possible in most of this stuff. If it just helps you to make a decision and helps you to understand what questions to ask when you are ordering a set of pickups for your guitar. So ask a lot of questions. That's the main thing. If you have any questions, if you want to contribute an idea for our daily post, please let us know at dylanpickups.com, at Dylan Pickups on Facebook, Dylan Pickups on YouTube, and dylanmccurchie.com. Also, that's my name. So I hope to see you next time.